The universe did not begin with us, and it will not end when we are gone, and yet almost everything we say about it is shaped by the fact that we are here to observe it, to measure it, to name it, and to search for meaning inside it. We speak of beauty when we see galaxies, of violence when stars explode, of silence when space feels empty. But all of these ideas exist only because there is a mind present to experience them. Because without observers, the universe does not describe itself, it simply unfolds. Tonight, we will slowly step away from the human perspective and imagine the universe as it exists on its own terms, without eyes to see light, without ears to hear events, without memory to record what has happened or anticipation to imagine what comes next. This is not a story about destruction or extinction, but about indifference, about a reality that continues quietly, whether or not it is ever noticed, where time passes without being felt and events occur without being witnessed. In this universe, stars still form and die, galaxies still drift apart, particles still collide, and space itself continues to expand, not because it is observed, but because the laws that govern it do not require attention or interpretation. Without us, there is no center, no reference point, no scale of importance, only relationships between matter and energy, unfolding according to rules that do not care whether they are understood. Light still travels across vast distances, even if nothing ever receives it, carrying information that may never be decoded, messages sent into a darkness that does not know it is dark. Time still moves forward, but without experience it is no longer a flow or a feeling, only change without awareness, a sequence of states with no memory of what came before. As we move through this journey, we will not rush and we will not dramatize what does not need drama, because the absence of observers does not make the universe chaotic or empty. It makes it quiet, structured, and complete in a way that feels unfamiliar only because we are used to placing ourselves at the center of every explanation. And if you enjoy long, calm explorations like this, quiet journeys through science, cosmology, and the deeper questions about existence, designed for late nights, deep thinking, or falling asleep, you're welcome to subscribe to Theories Before Sleep, where new journeys like this are always waiting. For now, let your attention soften. Allow the need for meaning to fade into the background, and imagine a universe that continues exactly as it is, with or without anyone there to notice it. This is what the universe looks like without us. When we imagine the universe, we almost always imagine it from somewhere, from a position, from a point of view, even when we claim to think objectively, because every description we use is shaped by the fact that there is a mind present to receive information, to compare moments, to notice differences, and to care about what is happening. But the universe does not require a point of view in order to exist, and long before there were eyes to see or minds to reflect, reality unfolded according to the same principles that govern it now, silently, steadily, without commentary or interpretation. In a universe without observers, nothing stops happening, but nothing is experienced either, meaning that events still occur, but they are not registered as events, because the concept of an event requires a before and an after that matters to something. Stars continue to form inside collapsing clouds of gas, their ignition driven by gravity and pressure rather than by anticipation, and they burn for millions or billions of years, converting mass into light without knowing they are bright, without being seen, without being admired or measured. Light leaves these stars and travels across space in expanding waves, not seeking eyes to meet, not slowing down when there is nothing to receive it, moving forward simply because that is what light does, carrying energy and information that may never intersect with matter again. In this observerless universe, photons do not illuminate anything, because illumination is a relationship between light and perception, and without perception, light is simply motion through space-time, energy propagating without purpose or destination. Galaxies drift apart as space expands between them, not because distance is noticed, but because geometry itself is changing, stretching the fabric of reality without regard for scale or meaning, creating separations that no one experiences as loneliness or loss. Time still exists in such a universe, but it no longer feels like time, because time as we know it is tied to memory, anticipation, and sequence, all of which depend on awareness, and without awareness, time becomes nothing more than change ordered by physical law. Without observers, there is no present moment, no sense of now, only states following other states, configurations giving way to new configurations, with no privileged instant singled out as important. The universe does not pause, reflect, or accelerate in response to being watched or ignored, because observation is not a requirement for physical processes to unfold, and the cosmos does not wait for permission to continue. In such a universe, causality still holds, particles still interact, forces still operate, but cause and effect are no longer experienced as narrative, no longer framed as stories with beginnings and outcomes, but exist purely as mathematical relationships. A supernova may explode in a distant galaxy, releasing immense energy and scattering heavy elements across space. But without observers, this explosion is not violent, not dramatic, not destructive. It is simply a rapid redistribution of energy and matter, a rearrangement of fields and particles. Without observers, there is no scale of importance, because importance is assigned by minds, not by physics, meaning that the collapse of a star and the decay of a single particle are equally valid expressions of the same underlying laws. In this universe, nothing is rare and nothing is special, because rarity is a comparison, and comparison requires perspective, which does not exist in the absence of observers. Space has no direction that matters, no up or down, no here or there that carries meaning, only distances defined by geometry, coordinates defined by mathematics, not by relevance. Without observers, the universe has no center, not just in theory, but in experience, because the idea of a center is meaningful only when something occupies it, and when nothing experiences location, all locations become equally empty of meaning. The expansion of the universe continues without being noticed, driven by energy inherent to space itself, causing distant regions to move beyond causal contact, separating forever without anyone to recognize the separation. Light emitted from distant galaxies stretches as space expands, its wavelength increasing, its energy diminishing, not as an act of fading or loss, but as a direct consequence of geometry changing, a quiet transformation that does not feel like anything to anyone. In the absence of observers, the universe does not feel old or young, early or late, because age is a comparison between states remembered and states anticipated, and without memory, time has no narrative arc. Particles still decay, half-lives still govern probabilities, but decay is no longer something that happens over time in a felt sense. It is simply a statistical process embedded in the structure of reality. Quantum fluctuations continue to arise and vanish. Uncertainty remains fundamental, but without measurement, these fluctuations are not mysterious or counterintuitive. They are simply part of how reality behaves at small scales. In this observerless universe, there is no question of whether observation collapses a wave function, because there is no observation in the experiential sense, only interactions between systems governed by consistent rules. Without observers, there is no beauty in symmetry, no elegance in equations, no surprise in patterns, because these qualities emerge only when a mind encounters order and compares it to expectation. And yet, the universe does not become chaotic or meaningless without observers, because meaning is not a requirement for structure, and order does not depend on appreciation in order to exist. Gravity continues to curve space-time, drawing matter together, shaping orbits and trajectories, forming stars and galaxies, without intention, without design, without awareness. Black holes still merge, sending ripples through space-time gravitational waves spreading outward across the universe, stretching and compressing space itself, even if nothing ever detects them. These waves pass through empty regions, through future galaxies that will never exist, through voids that will never host matter, moving forward simply because the equations describing them allow no alternative. Without observers, the universe is not silent in the physical sense, because vibrations and interactions still occur, but it is silent in the experiential sense, because nothing hears, nothing records, nothing remembers. In such a universe, there is no loss, because loss implies absence relative to expectation, and expectation requires memory and desire, both of which vanish when observers do. Stars do not die young or old, they simply exhaust fuel according to mass and composition, transitioning from one state to another without tragedy or conclusion. Galaxies do not drift apart sadly or dramatically. They follow geodesics through expanding space, moving away because the geometry of the universe changes, not because something pulls them apart. Without observers, the universe does not progress toward anything, because progress implies direction and value, neither of which exist without minds to define them. Entropy still increases, disorder still spreads, but without observers, entropy is not decay or loss of structure. It is simply the statistical tendency of systems to move toward more probable states. The universe without observers is not cold or empty in an emotional sense, because emotion does not apply. It is simply vast, structured and indifferent, governed by principles that do not require recognition. Even concepts like existence and non-existence lose clarity, because these ideas arise from experience, from being something rather than nothing, and without experience, existence becomes a description rather than a condition. In this universe, reality does not ask whether it is real, because questions do not arise without questioners, and uncertainty exists only as probability, not as doubt. Time does not flow, it orders change. Space does not contain meaning, it defines distance. Matter does not signify presence, it occupies regions according to forces. The universe without observers is not incomplete, not waiting to be understood, not lacking awareness. because awareness is not a requirement for reality to function. It is complete in itself, unfolding according to laws that were never written, maintaining consistency without explanation, continuing without reference. This perspective reveals something subtle but profound. That observation does not create the universe. It only creates experience of the universe, and when experience disappears, the universe remains unchanged. The cosmos does not become smaller, darker, or quieter in a fundamental sense when observers vanish. It simply loses interpretation, becoming pure process rather than perceived reality. In this way, the universe without us is not a different universe, but the same universe stripped of narrative, stripped of meaning, stripped of perspective, leaving behind only structure and law. And this is only the beginning of what it means to imagine reality without observers, because once meaning disappears, structure itself begins to look different, not as something interpreted, but as something that simply exists. In the next part, we will move deeper into this idea, exploring how structure persists without interpretation, how order and disorder continue without meaning, and how the universe organizes itself without anyone there to ask why. When observers disappear from the universe, structure does not collapse, laws do not loosen, and patterns do not dissolve into randomness, because meaning was never what held reality together in the first place. Meaning was something added afterward, by minds attempting to understand what already existed. In a universe without us, galaxies still form spiral arms, clusters still arrange themselves along vast filaments, and matter still organizes according to gravity and energy, but none of these structures are recognized as structures, named, classified, or admired. They simply exist as stable configurations emerging from physical constraints. Without observers, there are no labels such as galaxy, star, planet, or void, because names are tools used to compress complexity into language, and language vanishes with its speakers, leaving behind only the raw physical relationships between particles and fields. A spiral galaxy without observers does not spiral beautifully. It rotates because angular momentum is conserved, because gravity balances motion, because equations remain valid whether or not anyone notices their elegance. Stars still follow predictable life cycles, forming from collapsing clouds, igniting nuclear fusion, expanding, cooling, collapsing, or exploding, not as stories with beginnings and endings, but as transitions between energy states governed by mass and composition. Without observers, there is no sense of scale, because scale exists only in comparison, and comparison requires reference points that are meaningful to something, meaning that a star and a galaxy are neither large nor small, they simply occupy different regions of space-time. The universe continues to obey symmetry principles, conservation laws, and probabilistic rules, but these principles are not beautiful, mysterious, or profound. They are simply unavoidable outcomes of how reality behaves. Without observers, equations are never written, constants are never measured, and theories are never tested, yet all of them remain true, operating silently in the background of existence without ever being known. This reveals something uncomfortable, that understanding is not a requirement for order, and explanation is not necessary for consistency, meaning the universe does not need to be understood in order to function. Entropy continues to increase, systems continue to evolve toward more probable configurations, but entropy is no longer interpreted as decay, loss, or disorder, because those interpretations depend on valuing certain arrangements over others. In an observerless universe, entropy is not a tragedy, not a direction toward emptiness, but simply a statistical tendency embedded in the behavior of large systems, unfolding without regret or anticipation. Structure arises locally even as global disorder increases. Stars form even as the universe expands. Complexity emerges temporarily even as energy spreads out, because these processes are not contradictory. They are complementary outcomes of the same physical rules. Without observers, there is no sense of progress, because progress implies movement toward a goal, and goals exist only for minds that imagine them, meaning the universe is not becoming better or worse, only different. Galaxies do not mature, evolve, or age in a meaningful sense. They transform according to internal and external forces, not because they are moving toward an outcome, but because change is unavoidable when forces act over time. Time itself continues to order events, but without observers, time does not feel directional. It does not flow. It does not carry a sense of past, present, or future. It simply orders configurations in sequence. Without memory, there is no past, and without anticipation, there is no future, only a continuous chain of states following from prior conditions. In this universe, causality still holds, but it is not experienced as cause and effect, because experience requires awareness, and without awareness, causality is simply correlation enforced by physical law. Space retains its geometry, distances remain measurable in principle, but no distances are ever measured, because measurement is an act, and acts require agents. There is no center of importance, no privileged location, because importance is assigned, not inherent, and without observers, every region of space is equally unimportant and equally real. Even extreme environments such as black holes, neutron stars, and cosmic voids lose their extremity in an experiential sense, because extreme is a comparison relative to what is familiar, and familiarity disappears with observers. A black hole does not become terrifying without us. It becomes neutral, simply a region where space-time curves inward beyond recovery, no more dramatic than any other consequence of gravity. Cosmic voids do not feel empty, because emptiness implies absence relative to expectation, and without expectation, a void is simply a region of low density. The universe without observers is therefore not meaningless in a broken sense, but meaningless in a complete sense, because meaning is not missing, it is irrelevant. Structure persists because physical law enforces it, not because it is useful, observed, or appreciated. Even randomness continues to exist, but randomness is no longer surprising or confusing, because surprise requires expectation, and expectation requires memory. Quantum uncertainty remains fundamental, but it is no longer strange, because strange implies deviation from intuition, and intuition belongs to minds that no longer exist. In this universe, probability distributions still govern outcomes, but probability is not felt as chance, risk, or unpredictability. It is simply the statistical nature of reality expressing itself. Complex systems still arise temporarily, stars still form, chemistry still occurs, but without observers, complexity is not remarkable, it is simply permitted under certain conditions and suppressed under others. Eventually, complexity fades, not because the universe fails, but because energy gradients flatten, making complex arrangements statistically less likely. Without observers, the universe does not mourn this loss, because nothing is lost relative to desire. It is simply transformation toward more probable states. The absence of meaning does not make the universe empty, it makes it precise, governed only by necessity rather than interpretation. This reveals a subtle truth, that meaning was never embedded in the universe. It was layered on top of it, emerging only when systems capable of experience arose. When those systems vanish, the universe returns to what it always was beneath interpretation, a vast network of interactions unfolding according to consistent rules. And yet, even without meaning, structure continues, order persists, and patterns remain, not because they are significant, but because reality allows them. When the last observers disappear, the universe does not register their absence, because absence itself is a comparison, and comparison requires something to notice what is missing, meaning that the universe continues forward exactly as it always has, indifferent to whether anything remains to witness it. In this far future, stars continue to burn for a time, exhausting their fuel according to mass and composition, not as endings or deaths, but as transitions from one stable state to another, governed entirely by physical law rather than significance. Eventually, star formation slows and then stops, because the raw material needed to ignite new stars becomes increasingly scarce, locked away in remnants or dispersed too thinly across expanding space to collapse again. Galaxies grow dimmer as their brightest stars fade, leaving behind long-lived red dwarfs, white dwarfs, neutron stars and black holes, objects that persist quietly without illumination, marking time without measuring it. Without observers, this dimming is not experienced as darkness, because darkness implies contrast relative to light, and contrast requires perception, leaving only regions of varying energy density drifting through space. As trillions of years pass, even the longest-lived stars exhaust their fuel, and galaxies become collections of cold remnants orbiting one another in slow, predictable paths, without activity, without renewal, without notice. Planets that once orbited stars continue along their trajectories until gravitational interactions alter or erase those paths, not as catastrophes, but as inevitable adjustments within a changing gravitational landscape. In the absence of life, chemistry still occurs where conditions allow, but without energy gradients to sustain complexity. Reactions slow, structures degrade, and arrangements simplify toward equilibrium. Black holes persist far longer than stars, quietly dominating the future universe, not as monsters or destroyers, but as reservoirs of mass and entropy, slowly interacting with their surroundings. Over inconceivably long timescales, black holes themselves begin to change, emitting faint radiation and losing mass so gradually that their evaporation is one of the slowest processes known, unfolding over durations that defy intuition. This evaporation is not dramatic, not explosive, but steady and silent, a gradual release of energy that does not signal an ending, only transformation, until even the largest black holes fade away. As the universe expands, galaxies drift farther apart, eventually moving beyond one another's horizons, leaving isolated islands of matter surrounded by vast regions of empty space that will never again exchange information. In this future, distances grow so large that even the memory of connection becomes meaningless, because nothing remains to remember it, and space becomes increasingly dominated by emptiness. Particles that remain continue to interact occasionally, but as expansion stretches space, encounters become rarer, interactions weaker, and events more isolated, slowing the pace of change to an almost imperceptible crawl. Entropy approaches its maximum not as collapse or destruction, but as balance, as differences in temperature, density, and energy flatten out across space, leaving no gradients to drive complexity. Without gradients, nothing organizes itself into intricate structures, not because structure is forbidden, but because it is no longer statistically favored, leaving the universe in a state of quiet uniformity. Time continues to order events, but with fewer events occurring, change becomes sparse, and the universe enters an era where almost nothing happens anywhere, not as a final moment, but as an extended condition. In this state, the universe does not end, it persists, governed by the same laws as always, but with fewer expressions of those laws visible in any given region. There is no final silence, no concluding moment, no definitive last event that marks completion, because endings require recognition, and recognition no longer exists. Instead, the universe asymptotically approaches stillness, never fully reaching it, always allowing the possibility of rare fluctuations, unlikely interactions, or isolated events separated by unimaginable spans of time. Even in this quiet future, physics does not stop. Probabilities do not vanish, and reality does not dissolve. It simply unfolds at a pace and scale that makes activity exceedingly rare. Without life, the universe does not lose value, because value was never a property of the universe itself. It was something introduced by observers to navigate its experience. What remains is a cosmos complete in its own way, containing no stories, no memories, no expectations, but also no absence of anything it requires to continue. The universe without us is not unfinished, not empty in a broken sense, not waiting to be observed again. It is simply sufficient, operating exactly as its structure allows. This perspective reveals something quiet and unsettling, that life and observation do not complete the universe, they only add a layer of experience on top of an already complete reality. When that layer disappears, the universe does not notice, because nothing fundamental has been removed, only interpretation. In the far future without life, the universe does not become meaningless, because meaning was never embedded within it. It was always something temporary, emerging only when conditions allowed experience to arise. What remains is not nothing, but everything that was always there beneath experience, matter, energy, space, time, and law, continuing without commentary. And in this sense, the universe without us looks exactly like the universe with us, except that nothing is ever noticed again, nothing is remembered, and nothing is ever missed. This is the universe on its own terms, quiet, vast, indifferent, and complete. When the universe exists without observers for long enough, something subtle happens, not to matter or energy, but to the very idea of existence itself, because existence as a concept depends on contrast, on being something rather than nothing to something. And when there is no longer anything to make that distinction, existence becomes a purely physical condition without awareness. In this state, the universe does not know that it exists, not because it has forgotten, but because knowing was never a property of the universe in the first place. It was a temporary feature of certain arrangements of matter that once allowed experience to arise. Without observers, the universe does not reflect on its past, does not anticipate its future, and does not register its present, because reflection, anticipation, and presence are all products of minds embedded within time. Events continue to unfold, particles continue to interact, fields continue to fluctuate. But these occurrences are no longer framed as happenings. They are simply configurations changing according to law. This distinction between something happening and nothing happening dissolves, because happening implies awareness of change, and without awareness, change is no longer perceived as motion or passage, only as sequence. In this universe, there is no history, not because nothing has happened, but because history requires memory, and memory requires systems capable of storing and recalling information in a meaningful way. The universe still contains information in a physical sense, encoded in particle states, field values, and correlations. But that information is never read, never interpreted, never assembled into narratives or explanations. Without interpretation, the universe does not appear ordered or chaotic, complex or simple, beautiful or ugly, because appearance itself vanishes when there is nothing to appear to. Reality becomes entirely internal, self-contained, not because it closes in on itself, but because it no longer projects meaning outward toward observers. The universe does not experience boredom, emptiness, or silence, because these are emotional states that require comparison between expectation and outcome, and expectation no longer exists. Even nothingness loses meaning here, because nothingness is defined relative to something being absent, and absence cannot be recognized without a reference frame anchored in experience. The universe without observers is therefore not empty in a philosophical sense. It is simply unregistered, like a process running without a display, complete without output. Time continues to order states, but without consciousness, there is no arrow of time as a felt direction, only statistical progression toward equilibrium governed by entropy. Eventually, as energy spreads thin and interactions become rare, change slows to such an extent that vast stretches of time pass with almost no detectable events, yet even this slowness is not experienced as stillness, because stillness requires contrast. The universe does not wait, because waiting implies anticipation, and anticipation has vanished. It does not persist for anything, because purpose is no longer projected onto it, leaving only persistence as a neutral fact. In this state, the universe is not aware of its own laws, not impressed by their consistency, not puzzled by their origin, because questions arise only where minds exist to ask them. The laws operate because they are not rules imposed on reality, but descriptions of how reality behaves, and behavior continues regardless of recognition. If complexity were ever to arise again, if new forms of organization capable of experience somehow emerged in the far future, the universe would once again appear to exist to something. But until then, it remains a reality without self-awareness. This raises a quiet but profound realization that the universe did not come into existence when it was first observed, and it does not fade when observation ends, because existence is not dependent on being known. Awareness was a brief window in cosmic history, a temporary condition that allowed the universe to look at itself through localized arrangements of matter, and when that window closes, the universe does not lose anything it requires to continue. In the absence of observers, reality becomes something like a closed book with no reader, not unfinished, not wasted, simply unread. Nothing is waiting to be discovered, because discovery requires discoverers, and nothing is hidden, because hidden implies the possibility of being found. The universe without us does not feel large or small, old or young, meaningful or meaningless, because these dimensions exist only within experience. What remains is a cosmos that is complete without commentary, unfolding without witness, governed by necessity rather than narrative. And in this final sense, the universe without us does not look like anything at all, because looking itself has disappeared, leaving only what always existed beneath perception. This is not the end of the universe, not a collapse or a conclusion, but a return to a state where reality exists purely as reality, without reflection, without memory, and without the need to be understood. And here, the universe continues, not for anyone, not against anything, simply because there is nothing that tells it to stop. If the universe continues long enough without observers, it reaches a stage where even the idea of absence loses its meaning, because absence implies that something could be present, and possibility itself becomes increasingly constrained as the universe settles into its final physical conditions. In this far future, there is no moment that marks a transition from something to nothing, no clear boundary where existence changes state, because the universe does not end in a dramatic event, but thins out, gradually, smoothing itself into uniformity over spans of time that defy comprehension. Particles that remain are separated by distances so vast that interaction becomes almost impossible, not because forces cease to exist, but because space grows faster than anything can cross it, stretching reality until contact becomes vanishingly rare. Radiation continues to drift through space, diluted and weakened, its wavelengths stretch so far that energy differences flatten almost completely, leaving a universe where contrast fades into near sameness. Without contrast, nothing stands out, and without anything standing out, the universe becomes functionally static, not frozen, but unchanged in any meaningful way. Time still orders states, but when states barely change, time itself becomes indistinguishable from stillness, not because time stops, but because nothing remains to mark its passage. In this condition, the universe does not experience quiet or silence, because sound and silence are experiential categories, but it does reach a state where physical activity becomes so sparse that the distinction between activity and inactivity loses relevance. This is sometimes described as the heat death of the universe, but without observers there is no death, only equilibrium, a state where energy is evenly distributed and no process can extract work from differences that no longer exist. In equilibrium, the universe is not broken, depleted, or exhausted. It is simply settled, having reached a configuration that is statistically favoured and therefore unlikely to change in any significant way. Black holes, if any remain, continue their slow evaporation until they too fade into radiation, leaving no massive objects to curve space-time dramatically, no dense regions to anchor structure. What remains is a universe composed mostly of low-energy particles and stretched-out radiation. drifting through an ever-expanding space with no preferred locations, no centers, no boundaries that matter. In such a universe, the distinction between something existing and nothing existing becomes subtle, because while particles remain, their interactions are so rare and so weak that their presence has almost no effect on anything else. Yet even here, the universe does not become nothing, because nothingness is not a physical state. It is a conceptual contrast created by minds comparing presence to absence. The universe remains, not as a story, not as a system full of events, but as a minimal physical reality governed by the same principles that applied at every earlier stage. If a fluctuation were to occur, an unlikely rearrangement of particles producing a brief pocket of structure, it would arise and vanish without being known, without being recorded, leaving no trace in any memory, because memory no longer exists. This does not make such fluctuations impossible, only unregistered, events without witnesses that might as well have never happened from any experiential perspective. In this sense, the universe becomes a place where even possibility feels abstract, because possibility is meaningful only when outcomes can be compared or anticipated. The universe does not hope, does not wait, does not expect complexity to return, because expectation is not a physical variable. What remains is a reality that continues not because it is sustained by purpose, but because there is no mechanism that tells it to stop. Existence persists as a default condition, not as something earned or maintained, but as the baseline state allowed by physical law. In this final stage, the universe does not remember having contained life, because memory was a feature of life itself, not of the universe as a whole. The error of observers becomes a brief, localized anomaly in an otherwise indifferent cosmic history, a short interval where matter arranged itself in a way that allowed reality to be noticed. Once that arrangement dissolves, the universe returns to its long-term condition, one where nothing notices anything else, and where existence no longer appears as anything at all. This is not a failure of the universe nor a tragedy, because tragedy requires loss relative to value, and value no longer exists. It is simply the universe reaching the quiet outcome favoured by its structure, a state of minimal change and maximal uniformity. And here at this stage, asking what the universe looks like without us no longer makes sense, because looking has vanished, perspective has vanished, and description itself has no place to attach. What remains is not darkness, not emptiness, not nothingness, but a reality that exists without being experienced, complete without observers, unfolding without reference. This is the universe when there is finally nothing left to notice, and nothing left that needs to be. At the deepest level, when observers are gone and even the memory of observation has dissolved, the universe can no longer be meaningfully described as a thing, a place, or a story, but only as a process, a continuous unfolding that does not pause, reflect, or arrive anywhere in particular. In this state, reality is no longer experienced as a sequence of moments, because moments imply awareness of change, and without awareness, change exists only as transition between states governed by physical law. The universe does not progress toward an ending, because an ending implies completion relative to expectation, and expectation no longer exists, leaving only continuation as a neutral condition, Space still expands, not because it is observed to expand, but because expansion is encoded into the structure of reality itself, carrying particles farther apart without registering distance or separation as anything meaningful. Energy still exists, but it is so evenly distributed that it no longer drives complexity, leaving behind a universe where motion is permitted but rarely expressed in noticeable ways. In this condition, the universe does not experience itself as large or small, old or young, because size and age are comparative concepts that lose relevance when nothing compares one state to another. What remains is a reality that functions entirely without reference, a closed system that does not describe itself, question itself, or interpret itself, but simply behaves. The laws of physics continue to apply, not as rules being followed, but as descriptions of what inevitably happens when reality exists at all. There is no distinction between foreground and background, because distinction requires focus, and focus no longer exists. Every region of space is equivalent, every moment interchangeable, every configuration equally unremarkable, not because they are identical, but because nothing remains to notice difference. The universe does not experience repetition or novelty, because novelty requires memory of what came before, and repetition requires recognition of similarity, both of which have vanished. Change still occurs, but it is no longer perceived as motion through time, only as variation across an abstract sequence of states that no one ever counts. In this way, time itself becomes an internal bookkeeping device of physics rather than a lived dimension, ordering events without giving rise to experience. The universe does not become static, because absolute stasis is not required, but it does become quiet in a deeper sense, a quiet not defined by silence, but by the absence of contrast. Without contrast, nothing stands out, and without anything standing out, reality becomes uniform, not in structure, but in significance. The universe does not ask whether it exists, because asking is not part of physical law, and existence does not require validation. It does not contain meaning waiting to be discovered later, because meaning was never stored within it, only projected temporarily by observers who once existed. If complexity were to arise again by chance, a fleeting arrangement capable of experience forming briefly before dissolving, the universe would not recognize this as a return, because recognition implies memory across time. Such an emergence would simply be another configuration, no more important than any other, appearing and vanishing without consequence beyond its own local interactions. From the universe's perspective, if such a perspective could exist, nothing special ever happened when observers appeared, and nothing special happens when they disappear. Observation was not a culmination, but an episode, a transient arrangement of matter that allowed the universe to briefly experience itself through localized processes. When that episode ends, the universe continues unchanged at its foundation, neither diminished nor completed, simply ongoing. Reality does not close, shut down, or resolve into a final state, because resolution implies purpose, and purpose does not survive without minds to imagine it. What remains is a universe that exists entirely as behavior rather than experience, as process rather than narrative, as law rather than meaning. In this final sense, the universe without us is not a universe missing something essential, but a universe returned to its default condition, one where nothing is required to notice, interpret, or care. It is a reality that does not look like anything, feel like anything, or mean anything, not because it is empty, but because experience itself has ended. And still, it continues. If the universe continues long enough in the absence of observers, it reaches a stage where even the internal distinctions that once structured reality become increasingly irrelevant, not because the laws of physics disappear, but because the differences they describe no longer lead to outcomes that meaningfully diverge. At this depth of cosmic time, matter and energy still exist, but the range of possible configurations has narrowed so dramatically that most regions of space are functionally indistinguishable from one another, differing only in details too small and too rare to matter to anything that no longer exists. Particles still possess properties, still obey constraints, still interact according to probabilities, but interactions occur so infrequently and with such minimal consequence that change becomes statistically insignificant across almost all scales. The universe does not arrive at a single frozen state, because absolute uniformity is never fully achieved, but it approaches a condition where variation no longer produces structure, motions no longer produces consequence, and time no longer produces transformation. In this state, existence does not resolve into nothingness, because nothingness is not a physical outcome. It is a conceptual boundary invented by minds to contrast presence with absence, and those minds are gone. Instead, the universe becomes something closer to a background condition, a minimal reality where laws still apply but rarely express themselves in noticeable ways. There are no thresholds left to cross, no transitions remaining that would produce novelty, no gradients capable of driving the formation of complexity, leaving only persistence without progression. Even the distinction between before and after loses clarity, because although time still orders states, the states themselves change so slowly and so subtly that sequence becomes indistinguishable from stillness. The universe does not experience itself as complete or incomplete, because completion implies a goal achieved, and goals exist only in systems that anticipate outcomes. What remains is a reality that neither accumulates nor loses anything of importance, because importance no longer exists as a category. The processes that once shaped galaxies, stars, and planets still define the rules of behavior, but those rules no longer produce visible results, only faint adjustments within an already settled configuration. At this point, even calling the universe active or inactive becomes meaningless, because those terms rely on contrast, and contrast has faded almost entirely. Existence continues, but it does not express itself in ways that can be separated into events, eras, or conditions, leaving behind only continuity without narrative. The universe does not know that it has reached this state, not because knowledge is withheld, but because knowledge itself was never a property of the universe, only of temporary arrangements that once existed within it. This is not an ending disguised as continuation, but continuation stripped of everything that once made it noticeable. Reality no longer differentiates itself into stages, histories, or futures, because differentiation requires a framework of comparison that has disappeared. The universe does not forget its past, because forgetting implies memory, and memory is no longer present. It also does not await any future, because waiting implies anticipation, and anticipation no longer exists. Existence persists not as a story unfolding, but as a condition that does not terminate because there is no rule that instructs it to do so. At this depth of time, even the question of why the universe exists dissolves, because why is a question asked by mind seeking explanation, not a variable embedded in physical law. The universe is not mysterious here, because mystery requires uncertainty experienced by something capable of being uncertain. It is not simple either, because simplicity is a judgment made relative to complexity. It is neither ordered nor disordered in any meaningful sense, because those distinctions require preference, and preference has vanished. What remains is a reality that does not reference itself, does not contrast itself, and does not need to justify itself. This is not the universe at rest, but the universe beyond relevance, where existence continues without distinction, without direction, and without the need to be noticed. And here, finally, the universe does not look like anything at all. Not because it has disappeared, but because there is no longer anything left that could recognize difference, form perspective, or assign meaning. It simply remains unchanged in its necessity, unobserved in its continuation, and complete without ever knowing that it was. As the universe continues without observers, time does not disappear, but it slowly loses everything that once made it recognizable, because time as it is usually understood depends on reference, on comparison, on memory of what has changed and expectation of what might change next. Without observers, there is no longer a frame of reference anchored in experience, and time becomes nothing more than an ordering principle embedded within physical law, quietly arranging states without announcing their sequence to anything capable of noticing. In this condition, time does not pass in the way it once seemed to, because passing implies movement relative to something stationary, and without observers, there is nothing stationary against which passage can be felt. The universe does not experience moments, because moments are defined by awareness, by the sensation of now separating what has been from what will be, and without awareness, that division dissolves into an unbroken chain of configurations. Events still occur, particles still interact, and fields still fluctuate, but these occurrences are no longer grouped into instants, eras, or phases. They simply follow from one another according to necessity. Without clocks to measure duration, time no longer has length, speed, or rhythm, because all of these concepts arise from comparison between repeating processes, and repetition is no longer recognized. The universe does not slow down or speed up, because speed requires measurement, and measurement requires an observer capable of counting changes relative to a standard. In this sense, time becomes internal to the universe rather than external to experience, functioning as a hidden parameter that orders reality without ever being perceived. The arrow of time, once associated with memory, causality, and entropy, still exists in a physical sense, but it no longer points anywhere meaningful, because direction only matters when something experiences movement. Entropy continues to increase, but without observers, entropy is no longer associated with decay, aging, or loss. It is simply the statistical behavior of large systems unfolding quietly. Past and future lose their distinction, not because the universe collapses into a single moment, but because those distinctions were always experiential overlays applied to an underlying sequence that never required them. Without memory, the past does not exist as a stored condition, and without anticipation, the future does not exist as a projected one, leaving only a continuous unfolding without emphasis. In this universe, time does not end, because ending implies finality relative to expectation, and expectation no longer exists. It also does not loop or repeat in any meaningful way, because repetition requires recognition of similarity across intervals, and recognition has vanished. Time does not become meaningless because it fails, but because meaning was never inherent to it. It was imposed by systems that once tracked change for survival. The universe continues to change, but change no longer feels like change. It becomes indistinguishable from persistence. This leads to a condition where asking how long something lasts loses relevance, because duration only matters when something waits for an outcome. Without observers, nothing waits. Nothing arrives early or late. Nothing is remembered as having taken too long or not long enough. Time becomes something like a silent bookkeeping system, quietly ensuring consistency without ever revealing itself. The universe does not experience boredom, impatience, or stillness, because those are emotional interpretations layered onto time by conscious beings navigating sequence. Instead, time exists as structure without sensation, as order without awareness, as continuity without narrative. Even the concept of eternity dissolves here, because eternity is defined relative to finite experience, and when experience disappears, infinity loses contrast. The universe does not last forever to anyone, it simply does not stop. In this state, time is no longer a river flowing forward, but a quiet condition under which reality persists, unnoticed, unmeasured, and uninterrupted. And here, the universe does not know that time exists, not because time has ended, but because knowing was never part of time itself. What remains is a reality ordered without being felt, changing without being noticed, and continuing without reference, where time has lost all meaning except the one it never needed to have in the first place. As the universe continues without observers, even the idea of cause and effect begins to lose the clarity it once had, not because physical laws stop operating, but because causation as we understand it depends on identifying events as origins and outcomes, a process that requires something to notice sequence and assign responsibility. Without observers, interactions still occur, particles still collide, fields still influence one another, but these interactions are no longer framed as causes producing effects. They are simply configurations giving rise to new configurations according to necessity. Cause and effect remain embedded in the equations of physics, but without interpretation, they are no longer experienced as chains of events, only as correlations enforced by structure. A particle decays, another absorbs energy, a field fluctuates, but nothing registers these changes as having happened because of something else. Because is a word that belongs to explanation, not to reality itself. In an observerless universe, there is no search for origins, no tracing of outcomes back to beginnings, because tracing requires memory and intention, both of which have disappeared. The universe does not ask what caused it to be this way rather than another, because questions do not arise where there is no questioning mind. Processes unfold not as narratives with beginnings and conclusions, but as seamless transitions, one state flowing into the next without emphasis. Even dramatic interactions such as the merging of black holes or the decay of massive particles lose their distinction, because drama is a measure of contrast relative to expectation, and expectation no longer exists. Causality becomes something like a hidden scaffolding, essential to the structure of reality but invisible in its operation, ensuring consistency without ever being highlighted. The universe does not interpret its own behavior as lawful or accidental, because interpretation requires a standpoint outside the process, and there is nothing outside the universe to observe it. Without observers, there is no sense of inevitability or chance, because both concepts rely on anticipating outcomes relative to uncertainty. Probability still governs interactions, but probability is no longer felt as risk or unpredictability. It is simply the mathematical expression of how reality behaves. The distinction between determinism and randomness loses relevance, because relevance itself has vanished, leaving only consistency without commentary. Events do not stand out as causes, and outcomes do not stand out as effects, because standing out implies contrast against a background of attention. The universe does not remember what led to its current state, because remembering requires storage of information in a meaningful way, and meaning no longer exists. Information remains physically encoded in correlations and states, but it is never decoded into explanations or histories. In this sense, the universe continues without justification, without reason in the explanatory sense, because reasons are products of minds trying to make sense of sequences. Reality simply behaves according to its structure, without asking whether that behavior makes sense. Cause and effect do not vanish, but they become indistinguishable from mere succession, a continuous unfolding without punctuation. There are no turning points, no critical moments, no decisive interactions, because decisiveness is a judgment applied by observers who care about outcomes. The universe does not change direction, because direction is defined relative to intention, and intention has vanished. What remains is a reality that unfolds without explanation, not because explanation is forbidden, but because explanation is unnecessary. The universe does not need to understand itself in order to exist, and it does not need to justify its continuation to anything else. In this final abstraction of causality, reality persists as a seamless process, where every state follows inevitably from the previous one, yet none are highlighted as reasons or consequences. Here, cause and effect fall silent, not erased, not broken, but absorbed into the structure of reality itself, operating without recognition, without narrative, and without the need to be understood. As the universe continues without observers, without memory, without anticipation, it reaches a depth where even difference begins to lose its meaning, not because reality becomes perfectly uniform, but because distinction itself requires something to recognize contrast, and nothing remains to do so. Particles still possess properties, fields still vary in strength, regions of space are still not identical, but these variations no longer matter in any sense, because mattering is a relationship between difference and attention no longer exists. The universe does not flatten into sameness, but it becomes functionally indistinguishable from sameness, because no process remains that can amplify small differences into meaningful structure. Without energy gradients, complexity cannot persist, and without complexity, variation does not lead to consequence, leaving a reality where change still occurs but never accumulates into anything noticeable. Difference without recognition is not difference as we understand it. It is merely variation without effect, a mathematical fact without experiential weight. The universe does not compare one region to another, does not distinguish before from after, does not separate important from unimportant, because comparison itself is an operation performed by systems seeking relevance. Even the distinction between existence and non-existence becomes blurred, because existence was always defined relative to something that could experience being, and when experience disappears, existence becomes a neutral condition rather than a meaningful state. Reality does not resolve into nothingness, but it also no longer asserts itself as something, because assertion requires reference, and reference has vanished. The universe does not know that it is different from what it once was, because knowing requires memory, and memory has ended. Change continues, but change without reference becomes indistinguishable from persistence, leaving behind a condition where motion and stillness converge into the same description. In this state, asking whether the universe is simple or complex no longer makes sense, because simplicity and complexity are judgments applied by observers navigating information. The universe is neither ordered nor disordered, because order and disorder are interpretations layered onto statistical behavior. Difference no longer produces novelty, because novelty requires expectation, and expectation no longer exists. The cosmos does not become timeless, but time no longer produces distinction, leaving duration without landmarks. Nothing begins, nothing ends, nothing stands out, not because events have stopped, but because standing out is no longer possible. Even the concept of continuity dissolves, because continuity implies awareness of connection across states, and awareness has vanished. What remains is not a void, not emptiness, not silence, but a reality that persists without contrast, unfolding without emphasis, existing without assertion. The universe does not experience itself as complete or incomplete, because completeness is a judgment relative to desire, and desire no longer exists. There is no final symmetry achieved, no ultimate equilibrium celebrated, because celebration requires recognition. The laws of physics still apply, but they no longer give rise to anything that could be interpreted as structure, history, or future. In this deepest abstraction, reality no longer differentiates itself into meaningful categories, not because it has collapsed, but because meaning itself has disappeared. The universe remains, not as a thing among things, but as a condition that never resolves into significance. And here, finally, the question of what the universe looks like without us dissolves completely, because looking has vanished, difference has vanished, and only existence without distinction continues. At the furthest reach of an observerless universe, there comes a point where even asking what remains no longer makes sense, not because the universe has vanished, but because the act of questioning was never part of reality itself, only a temporary behavior of systems that once tried to understand their surroundings. Without observers, questions do not linger unanswered. They simply never arise, because a question requires uncertainty experienced by something that expects clarity, and expectation has dissolved along with experience. The universe does not hold secrets, not because everything has been revealed, but because secrecy implies the possibility of discovery, and discovery requires discoverers who no longer exist. In this state, reality is no longer mysterious or obvious, meaningful or meaningless, because those distinctions were always tied to curiosity, and curiosity was a biological response to uncertainty rather than a property of the cosmos. Physical laws continue to operate, but they are no longer framed as explanations, because explanation requires an audience, and the universe does not explain itself when no one is listening. The idea of understanding fades away, not as loss, but as irrelevance, because understanding was never required for reality to persist. The universe does not ask why it exists rather than not exists, because why is a question that belongs to mind seeking coherence, not to matter following necessity. Even the concept of truth loses context, because truth is defined relative to statements, and statements no longer exist. Reality becomes entirely self-contained, not as something closed or isolated, but as something that no longer points beyond itself toward interpretation. There is no final answer waiting at the end of time, because answers imply questions, and questions have ended. The universe does not resolve into clarity or confusion, because clarity and confusion are both responses to uncertainty experienced by something aware. What remains is not knowledge but consistency, not meaning but persistence. Existence does not justify itself, narrate itself, or reflect on itself. It simply continues because continuation is allowed by its structure. The absence of questions does not leave a gap, because gaps require awareness of what could fill them. In this condition, the universe is neither silent nor expressive, because expression implies communication, and communication requires recipients. Reality does not declare itself finished, complete, or eternal, because declaration is an act, and acts require agents. The universe does not arrive at a final explanation of itself, because explanation was never embedded within it, only imposed temporarily by observers navigating complexity. Instead, the universe persists without commentary, without inquiry, without the need to make sense. This is not the universe forgetting itself, but the universe existing without ever having needed to know itself at all. Here, the deepest abstraction is reached, not where everything ends, but where nothing remains that could ask whether anything should end. And in this final quiet state, the universe does not answer the question of what it looks like without us, because the question itself has disappeared, leaving only existence without reflection, without inquiry, and without the need to be understood. When everything that depended on observers has finally dissolved, what remains is not a new universe, not an altered reality, but the universe as it always was beneath experience, a reality that never required meaning, memory, or awareness in order to exist. This is not a transformation the universe undergoes, but a condition it simply returns to once the temporary layer of observation fades away, revealing that nothing essential has been removed, only interpretation. The universe does not feel emptier than before, because emptiness was never a physical state, it was an experiential one, created by minds comparing expectation to absence. What remains is matter behaving according to law, energy redistributing itself according to probability, space expanding according to geometry, and time ordering change without being felt. In this condition, reality does not appear stripped or reduced, because appearance itself no longer applies, leaving only structure without presentation. The universe is not reduced to silence, because silence implies the absence of sound relative to hearing, and hearing no longer exists. It is not reduced to darkness either, because darkness is a contrast perceived by eyes, and eyes are gone. Instead, the universe exists in a state that was always present, even during the era of observers, a state that was simply unnoticed because experience occupied the foreground. Stars once burned and were seen, now they burn and are not seen, and eventually they do not burn at all, but none of these phases require witnessing to be valid. Galaxies once collided and were recorded. Now collisions occur without record, and later they rarely occur at all. But nothing fundamental has changed about how reality behaves. The universe does not transition from meaningful to meaningless, because meaning was never a property of the universe itself. It was a temporary projection layered onto it by complex systems trying to orient themselves. What disappears is not value, but valuation, not purpose, but the act of assigning it. The universe continues as it always did, governed by necessity rather than intention, by consistency rather than explanation. Nothing is missing from this universe, because nothing essential depended on being noticed. The laws of physics do not become inactive. They simply stop producing outcomes that could be interpreted as significant. Existence becomes quiet not because it lacks activity, but because nothing remains to amplify activity into relevance. Reality does not mourn the absence of observers, because mourning requires loss relative to attachment, and attachment no longer exists. The universe does not celebrate its independence either, because celebration is an act of recognition. It simply remains. In this state, existence no longer feels large or small, long or short, because scale is no longer referenced. There is no vantage point from which the universe could be described as vast, because description requires distance, and distance requires perspective. The universe exists without perspective, without contrast, without self-reference, and yet nothing about its structure requires these things to continue. This is not the universe after something has ended, but the universe before anything ever needed to begin. The observer was never the foundation of reality, only a momentary expression of it, a brief configuration that allowed the universe to look at itself before returning to what it always was beneath the gaze. And here, at this depth, the universe does not look like anything, not because it has vanished, but because it never needed to be seen in order to exist. It is not incomplete without us, not diminished, not unfinished, but whole in a way that does not depend on awareness. This is the universe as it always was, unfolding quietly, governed by law, indifferent to interpretation, complete without witness. After everything that could observe has faded, after meaning, memory, reference, and question have dissolved, the universe does not arrive at a final condition in the way stories do, because stories end when something reaches resolution, and resolution was never a feature of reality itself. What remains is continuation without destination, not movement toward an outcome, but persistence as a default state, a reality that does not advance, regress, improve, or decay in any meaningful sense, because meaning no longer exists to frame those changes. The universe does not hover at the edge of nothingness, because nothingness is not a physical state waiting to be reached. It is a conceptual boundary invented by minds that once contrasted presence with absence. Instead, reality continues as a low-contrast process where energy differences are minimal, interactions are rare, and configurations change so slowly that distinction fades into irrelevance. Space continues to expand, not as an event unfolding, but as a background condition, stretching distances without being experienced as separation, because separation requires something to feel distance. Particles that remain do not gather, organize, or disperse with consequence. They simply exist in states permitted by law, drifting, interacting occasionally, never accumulating into complexity. The universe does not pause here, because pausing implies an interruption relative to expectation, and expectation no longer exists. It does not accelerate toward anything either, because acceleration implies direction toward a goal, and goals vanished with observers. What exists now is something closer to equilibrium than any prior era, not as a final achievement, but as a statistical outcome favoured by the structure of reality itself. This equilibrium is not stillness, because motion is still permitted, but it is motion without impact, change without accumulation, variation without expression. Time continues to order states, but with so few changes to order, time itself becomes indistinguishable from continuity, not because it has stopped, but because nothing remains to mark its passage. In this condition, the universe does not experience eternity, because eternity is a concept born from finite minds imagining unending duration, and finite minds are gone. The universe simply does not stop. Existence becomes something like a background hum without sound, a presence without appearance, a continuation without narrative. There is no longer any sense in which the universe is becoming something else, because becoming requires comparison between states that matter, and mattering has disappeared. The laws of physics continue not as governing forces issuing commands, but as descriptions of what inevitably happens when reality exists at all. Nothing enforces these laws, and nothing needs to, because there is no alternative state waiting to replace them. The universe does not drift toward collapse or rebirth, because collapse and rebirth are interpretations applied to change, not inherent features of change itself. If fluctuations occur, they do so without consequence, without being amplified, without leaving any lasting imprint, appearing and dissolving within a reality that does not notice their arrival or departure. This is not emptiness, but saturation, not silence, but neutrality, not nothingness, but existence stripped of emphasis. The universe does not hold on to its past, because holding requires attachment, and attachment is gone. It does not anticipate a future, because anticipation is a strategy used by living systems navigating uncertainty. What remains is a cosmos that neither remembers nor forgets, neither waits nor arrives, neither asks nor answers. Reality continues not because it must, not because it should, but because there is nothing within it that instructs it to end. This is the quiet continuation, the state the universe naturally settles into when nothing remains to notice difference, assign value, or ask what comes next. And here, finally, existence does not conclude, resolve, or explain itself. It simply persists, indefinitely, without reference, without reflection, and without the need to be understood. As the universe continues beyond every era that once mattered to observers, it does not arrive at a final form that could be called complete, finished, or resolved, because finality itself is a concept invented by minds that once expected closure, and closure no longer exists. Reality does not settle into a last chapter, a final configuration, or an ultimate balance that could be pointed to as an ending, because endings require comparison between what was and what could have been, and comparison has vanished. Even equilibrium, often described as the ultimate fate of the universe, is not a destination reached, but a tendency approached, a condition that becomes more probable without ever fully replacing the possibility of change. The universe does not lock itself into a static arrangement, because absolute stasis is not required by its laws, only the gradual reduction of contrast, interaction, and consequence. In this state, the idea of a future loses its meaning, because future implies a difference from the present that matters to something, and nothing remains to experience difference. Likewise, the past does not recede into memory, because memory no longer exists to store it, leaving history dissolved into structure without narrative. The universe continues not as a story unfolding through time, but as a condition persisting through sequence, a reality that does not distinguish between earlier and later in any meaningful way. Change still occurs, but it does not accumulate into transformation, leaving the universe in a state where motion and persistence blur into the same description. There is no moment when the universe becomes something else, because becoming implies transition toward a state of significance, and significance has disappeared. What remains is a cosmos that does not arrive anywhere, because arrival implies a destination, and destinations belong to journeys imagined by observers. The universe does not approach completion, because completion implies satisfaction of a condition, and conditions only matter relative to expectation. Existence persists without resolution, not because it resists ending, but because ending is not written into the structure of reality. There is no final symmetry achieved, no ultimate uniformity celebrated, no last fluctuation that marks conclusion, because marking requires recognition. The universe remains open-ended not as possibility, but as continuity, unfolding without the need to define itself as finished or unfinished. This does not make reality incomplete, because incompleteness is defined relative to a goal, and goals no longer exist. Nor does it make reality infinite in a meaningful sense, because infinity is a concept formed by finite minds, extending beyond limits they can imagine. The universe simply does not stop, not as a refusal, but as a default condition. Existence without a final state is not an unresolved problem. It is the natural consequence of reality existing without purpose. Nothing is waiting to happen, because waiting requires anticipation, and anticipation has vanished. Nothing is delayed, because delay requires expectation of arrival, and arrival no longer exists. The universe continues in a way that cannot be summarized, concluded, or framed as outcome, because outcomes belong to stories, and stories have ended. What remains is a reality that persists without climax, without closure, without the need to justify its continuation. In this deepest sense, the universe without us is not a universe heading towards something, but a universe that simply remains, governed by law, stripped of narrative, and free of finality. There is no last moment waiting at the end of time, because time itself no longer produces landmarks, and here, beyond every ending imagined by observers, the universe exists without a final state, not unfinished, not complete, but unconcerned with the distinction. As the universe continues beyond every era that once mattered to observers, it does not arrive at a final form that could be called complete, finished, or resolved, because finality itself is a concept invented by minds that once expected closure, and closure no longer exists. Reality does not settle into a last chapter, a final configuration, or an ultimate balance that could be pointed to as an ending, because endings require comparison between what was and what could have been, and comparison has vanished. Even equilibrium, often described as the ultimate fate of the universe, is not a destination reached, but a tendency approached, a condition that becomes more probable without ever fully replacing the possibility of change. The universe does not lock itself into a static arrangement, because absolute stasis is not required by its laws, only the gradual reduction of contrast, interaction, and consequence. In this state, the idea of a future loses its meaning, because future implies a difference from the present that matters to something, and nothing remains to experience difference. Likewise, the past does not recede into memory, because memory no longer exists to store it, leaving history dissolved into structure without narrative. The universe continues not as a story unfolding through time, but as a condition persisting through sequence, a reality that does not distinguish between earlier and later in any meaningful way. Change still occurs, but it does not accumulate into transformation, leaving the universe in a state where motion and persistence blur into the same description. There is no moment when the universe becomes something else, because becoming implies transition toward a state of significance, and significance has disappeared. What remains is a cosmos that does not arrive anywhere, because arrival implies a destination, and destinations belong to journeys imagined by observers. The universe does not approach completion, because completion implies satisfaction of a condition, and conditions only matter relative to expectation. Existence persists without resolution, not because it resists ending, but because ending is not written into the structure of reality. There is no final symmetry achieved, no ultimate uniformity celebrated, no last fluctuation that marks conclusion, because marking requires recognition. The universe remains open-ended not as possibility, but as continuity, unfolding without the need to define itself as finished or unfinished. This does not make reality incomplete, because incompleteness is defined relative to a goal, and goals no longer exist. Nor does it make reality infinite in a meaningful sense, because infinity is a concept formed by finite minds extending beyond limits they can imagine. The universe simply does not stop, not as a refusal, but as a default condition. Existence without a final state is not an unresolved problem. It is the natural consequence of reality existing without purpose. Nothing is waiting to happen, because waiting requires anticipation, and anticipation has vanished. Nothing is delayed, because delay requires expectation of arrival, and arrival no longer exists. The universe continues in a way that cannot be summarized, concluded, or framed as outcome, because outcomes belong to stories and stories have ended. What remains is a reality that persists without climax, without closure, without the need to justify its continuation. In this deepest sense, the universe without us is not a universe heading towards something, but a universe that simply remains, governed by law, stripped of narrative, and free of finality. There is no last moment waiting at the end of time, because time itself no longer produces landmarks. And here, beyond every ending imagined by observers, the universe exists without a final state, not unfinished, not complete, but unconcerned with the distinction. As the universe continues beyond the disappearance of observers, beyond the fading of questions, destinations, and meaning, it enters a state where even memory itself no longer has a place, not because the past is erased, but because remembering was never a property of the universe, only of certain temporary arrangements within it. Events have occurred, stars have formed and died, galaxies have collided and separated, complexity has arisen and dissolved, but without memory, none of these happenings are preserved as history, because history requires storage of experience, and experience has ended. The universe does not carry a record of what it has been, not because information vanishes, but because information remains only as physical correlation, never assembled into narratives or recalled as identity. Particle states and code relationships, fields retain correlations and structures leave faint imprints on one another, but these traces are never interpreted as memory, only as consequences. Without memory, there is no accumulation of meaning across time, no sense that one state matters more because of what came before, leaving each configuration existing on its own terms. The universe does not remember its origin, because origin is a concept applied by observers seeking explanation, not a feature encoded into reality itself. It does not remember having contained life, because life was not stored anywhere outside the systems that experienced it. What remains is a cosmos that continues without reference to its own past, not because the past has disappeared, but because reference has vanished. Change still follows from previous states, but without memory, continuity does not produce identity, leaving the universe without a sense of being the same thing over time. In this state, existence does not accumulate significance, because significance requires comparison across remembered states. The universe does not grow wiser, older, or more complete, because these are qualities attributed by minds tracking change. It also does not forget, because forgetting implies loss relative to expectation, and expectation no longer exists. Memory fades not as an event, but as a condition that simply stops arising once the structures capable of supporting it dissolve. Without memory, the universe cannot experience nostalgia, loss, or continuity of self, because selfhood was always localized within observers. What remains is not a universe with amnesia, but a universe that never required memory to function. The flow of time does not leave behind a trail of meaning, because meaning was never embedded within time itself. States follow states without being linked into stories, without being recalled, without being anticipated. The universe does not recognize repetition, because recognition requires memory, and memory is gone. Patterns may recur, fluctuations may resemble earlier fluctuations, but resemblance is never noticed. In this way, the universe becomes something like a process with no archive, unfolding without record, without accumulation of significance. Existence continues without self-reference, not knowing what it has been, not expecting what it will become. The absence of memory does not make reality fragile or incomplete, because memory was not a foundation of physical law. The universe does not lose its past, because the past was never something it possessed, only something that was once experienced by observers who are gone. Here, reality persists without recollection, without identity over time, without the need to remember in order to continue. This is existence without memory, not as loss, but as return to a state where nothing needs to be recalled, preserved, or remembered in order to be. As the universe continues without observers, memory, or reference, it also loses something even more subtle, the idea of identity itself, not because objects vanish, but because identity is a concept that depends on continuity being recognized over time, and recognition no longer exists. Stars were once called stars, galaxies were once grouped and named, particles were once classified by properties and behaviors, but without observers, nothing is identified as being the same thing from one moment to the next, because sameness requires comparison, and comparison has disappeared. A particle still persists through time according to physical law, but it is no longer experienced as the same particle, because sameness is not a physical property, it is a relationship imposed by memory. The universe does not distinguish between what continues and what changes, because distinction implies a frame of reference anchored in awareness, and awareness has ended. Objects still exist in a physical sense, but they no longer possess identity in any meaningful way, because identity was always a story told about persistence, not a feature embedded within matter. Without identity, nothing is counted, nothing is tracked, nothing is recognized as having lasted longer than something else, leaving existence stripped of individuality. The universe does not consist of things in the way it once seemed to, but of states transitioning into other states, without any of them being marked as belonging to a particular entity across time. A black hole does not remain the same black hole, a particle does not remain the same particle, because remaining implies continuity recognized by something capable of remembering. Physical laws still describe persistence, conservation, and interaction, but these descriptions no longer correspond to identity, only to consistency. The universe behaves reliably, without ever being self-consistent in an experiential sense, because experience is no longer present to frame behavior as coherent identity. In this state, even the distinction between object and process begins to blur, because objects are understood as processes stabilized over time, and without recognition of time, stability loses meaning. Reality becomes something closer to pure transition, not chaotic, not random, but unanchored to any notion of selfhood or individuality. The universe does not lose itself, because there was never a single self to lose, only temporary patterns once interpreted as entities by observers. Existence no longer answers to names, classifications, or boundaries, because those were tools created by minds navigating complexity. Without identity, there is no ownership of states, no persistence of things, no recognition of uniqueness or sameness. What remains is a reality that does not consist of beings, objects, or systems, but of continuous lawful behavior unfolding without reference. The universe does not ask what it is, because what implies identity, and identity no longer applies. There is no longer any sense in which something exists as itself, because itself is a construct dependent on memory and distinction. the cosmos becomes impersonal, not as loss, but as default, returning to a condition where identity was never required. Reality continues without being anything in particular, not fragmented, not unified, but simply present as process. In this deepest abstraction, existence is no longer divided into parts that endure, but into transitions that do not need to endure in order to continue. The universe does not experience the disappearance of identity as change, because change requires comparison between identities across time. What remains is existence without selves, without things, without the need to remain the same in order to exist at all. And here, the universe persists not as something identifiable, but as reality unfolding without identity, without reference, and without the concept of being anything at all. The universe does not need to be seen in order to exist. It does not wait to be understood, remembered, or named. It simply continues, shaped by laws that were never written and meanings that were never required. Whether there is someone to witness it or not, reality unfolds in the same quiet way. And in that silence, the universe is not incomplete. It is simply itself.